Hi, welcome to the Refugee Welcome Collective Lunch and Learn series. In these sessions, we aim to bring interesting and timely information to you, supporters of refugees. Whether you're a volunteer, community sponsor, resettlement staff, a local advocate, or just someone who's interested in learning more, we hope that you enjoyed today's session, Family Systems, Family Dynamics in Resettlement. Refugee Welcome Collective collaborates with partners to provide in-depth training programs, weekly learning sessions, resources, and on-demand technical assistance for sponsors, practitioners at resettlement agencies, refugees paired with sponsors, community and institutional partners, and others to support quality community sponsorship programs across the United States. Go ahead to the next slide, please, Grace. Some housekeeping. As a reminder for everyone joining the call today, there is a control panel in your upper right-hand corner that will allow you to submit questions through the questions box. There will be ample time at the end of the webinar for Q&A. Everyone on today's webinar is automatically muted. However, if you have any tech issues, please raise your hand through the control panel or submit a question in the questions box so we can assist you. Additionally, the presentation, any resources, and a recording will be sent to everyone following today's webinar. And this brings us to our presenter for today. Our presenter is myself. My name is Derek Feldman. I'm a program officer with Refugee Welcome Collective. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay. So talking about family systems, family dynamics in refugee resettlement. Our objectives for today is to understand sort of just the basics, just the basics. This isn't a PhD level class. So just the basics of the ecological model of human development, the individualism versus collectivism dimension of culture, and general family systems theory. Again, this is sort of a general introduction of sorts to some theoretical perspectives and some direct sort of issues involved with the families and relating to families in refugee resettlement. Number two, to become familiar with family dynamics, patterns, and structures common in refugee populations from collectivist cultures. And number three, to learn some core and wraparound services, as well as integration and self-sufficiency goals related to family well-being. Okay, let's go to the next slide. As a level set, again, as we explore issues of family systems and family dynamics in resettlement, it is extremely important for us to center ourselves in a practice, and I mean that quite literally as a practice. It's not something that you just gain full cultural humility. It's a continual practice that we all engage in, so we want to center ourselves in the practice of cultural humility, understanding that other cultural expectations and practices may feel different than what we experience or what feels right to us, but that doesn't mean that it's any less than our perspective. It's just a different perspective. And so really important to stay humble and recognize that we're just learning this, and it's a continual practice, and to always respect client agency, their ability to make their own decisions for themselves, that they are best placed to make decisions for their own life and to restore a sense of dignity and choices in their life. It's an important part that we play in terms of encouraging that and supporting that, and really trying not to hinder that or to make decisions for the clients that we work with. It's really important. Number two, learning these sort of theoretical concepts is meant to raise awareness and raise your sensitivity, but it's not meant to be used like to diagnose problems, okay? It is just sort of a general understanding. And what my hope is that when we bump up against some feelings of discomfort, because it feels like there's a real difference between ourselves and a family that we might be working with in this context of refugee resettlement, that you stop and and say, okay, I want to look at this. Why am I feeling uncomfortable with this? What is it about it that is difficult for me to accept, to work with in some way? And that's not to dismiss that. It's not to say that your intuition might be appropriate to be concerned about some particular issue or what have you. But I want us to, at very least, be not just sort of bulldoze over and just say like, okay, I need to fix this stuff because it's making me uncomfortable. What I want us to think about is that when we start to have those feelings, that we stop and that we think about what's going on. What are some other explanations potentially? Could this be an issue of kind of some cultural differences? And is that okay? How can you seek additional support from agency staff, from other members of your community group, from from other refugee former clients or other members of the community that you can reach out to and talk about a particular issue. So anyway, want to clear that and want to make sure that we're clear about that. Also want to, again, as a level set, so that we're all sort of operating under some similar assumptions, that we're all in agreement that no culture or no description of culture is monolithic. Families and individuals have their own histories, they have their own personal circumstances, their own personalities, their own preferences. And so we can talk about some generalities, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the particular client that you're working with falls exactly under some general description of culture. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So first, I'll take a step back and gonna go through a little bit of some theory. And this is the ecological model of human development, developed in part by Yuri Bronfenbrenner. And it's used by sociologists, psychologists, social workers, counselors, all kinds of people in the sort of social studies area, to conceptualize and a bit away from a sort of just thinking of a person as a total individual, not influenced by anything else, right? No one lives in a vacuum. We don't experience our lives, we don't experience ourselves, we don't experience life in a complete vacuum all by ourselves. And so we can't really be understood as sort of one individual outside of all of the different contexts in which we are influenced by and that we influence in turn. So Bronfenbrenner talks a little bit about sort of microsystems, so talking about the child or the individual, and these microsystems like family, like school, like your job, like health services, like your religious organization that you belong to, daycare facility, the neighborhood and playground, that influence this individual, and also that individual influences those little systems around them. Yeah, as you can see, they can get bigger. They can, you get into the sort of exosystem of like the larger economic system and what city and state that you live in, what country you live in, how the social services and healthcare system, how mass media is taking place in that system. Then there's sort of the larger macro systems of like ideologies and parts of culture, bigger culture. Then there's even the chrono system, that in time, right? We are a human being right now in 2023, which is different than we were or anyone else was 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 15 years ago or 100 years ago. We can see that, so in order to sort of understand ourselves and to understand each other, this sort of model takes into account the fact that we are not just an island as individuals, that we are influenced by and we in turn influence those other systems around us. Okay. Let's go to the next slide, please. Another social scientist, actually sort of in the business world, in the international business world, name is Gert Hofstede, theorized these sort of different dimensions of culture. He was comparing sort of generalized, so in that sort of macro system that we talked about, the sort of elements of culture and how there are different dimensions. He sort of theorized about 6 different dimensions. We're going to talk about one in particular, which is this. I think it's particularly particularly important to refugee resettlement, especially here in the United States, and that is this dimension of individualism versus collectivism. The reason why I want to focus on this particular dimension is because I think it is perhaps one of the more explicitly different on this scale of individualism versus collectivism that the United States lands on the sort of pretty far on the individualism spectrum, and that most, certainly not all, but most of the refugee populations come from countries and cultural sort of backgrounds that tend to be pretty far on the collectivism side of this scale. So it's a particularly important sort of dimension to understand because of the pretty extreme differences that we tend to see in terms of where American culture tends to be and where refugee populations tend to be coming from. And to understand this sort of dimension, here we'll give some sort of examples that like some features of individualistic cultures, the sort of overarching belief that everyone has a right to their own opinion, right? This is pretty well, baked into the cake of American culture, that everyone has the right to have their own opinions. Whereas in collectivist cultures, the opinions are really shaped by the group. Many people are sort of expected to conform to the general opinions of the group as a whole and the consensus. Whereas in an American culture, in more individualistic cultures, there's a greater sort of allowance for everyone kind of having their own difference of opinion, and that's okay. Whereas then that might feel really, really uncomfortable to people from collectivist culture, to sort of have lots of people all having their own opinions about something instead of everyone kind of coming to a consensus together and having an opinion together. A person's commitments include their own interests, self-education, their own debts. This is, features of individualistic cultures. A person's commitments include their own interests, self-education, their own debts. Whereas in collectivist cultures, commitments towards the family, harmony, respect, family honor, and loyalty are often emphasized over sort of individual interests, right? In individualistic cultures, education is a lifelong process. One constantly sort of learns new skills and acquires useful information and skills. In collectivist cultures, education is usually seen as primarily for young people, though not exclusively, but that sort of one learns how to behave. And then once they've learned how to behave, then they are expected to behave a certain way. In an individualistic culture, people are expected to care for themselves and perhaps their immediate family, whereas in collectivist cultures, everyone is part of a larger group and is expected to be loyal and care for its well-being, those larger groups, community, society. In individualistic cultures, people have high self-awareness and are independent, but in other cultures, in collectivist cultures, the emphasis is really on group awareness, and it precedes and that the sort of most important are mutual relationships, and the ties in those relationships are emphasized. In individualistic societies, friendship is sort of a basic human need. In collectivist cultures, friendships are determined by group membership. And then in individualistic cultures, decisions are made individually and are influenced by people's beliefs and opinions. And in collectivist cultures, the group really is responsible for making those decisions, not at the individual level. Okay, these are generalities. Again, I want us to remember that no person within a culture is monolithic or anything like that. There is certainly lots of room for this to ebb and flow and have its own sort of dynamic experience. However, you can see that, I mean, I just honestly, I grew up in the United States. I've been, in the United States, and I know that the sort of water that I'm swimming in is this more individualistic perspective. This part feels more natural to me. I understand what this means. I generally think that, individuals have their own, it's okay to have their own opinions about things, and that generally, each individual is sort of responsible for their own stuff and all of that kind of thing. I am aware of that, and I am aware that that there are other ways of being in the world, that collectivist cultures, people from collectivist cultures tend to have a more group perspective. It is not about one individual's personal needs, but a more emphasis around family harmony and group harmony, and whether everything makes sense for everyone, not just your own individual wants and needs. It's an important recognition, because we want to make sure that we're aware of our own perspectives. I want to help you become more aware of perhaps another perspective that perhaps you weren't familiar with or weren't as familiar with, and how, interacting with refugee clients, you might run into some issues that perhaps happen in the family, that perhaps feel quite different to you. And so let's recognize our own perspective, how we're coming to the work, in that work, and then how are we respectful of other people's perspectives when they don't exactly align with our own. Let's go to the next slide. In collectivist cultures, collectivism is the tendency on the individual and societal level to view oneself as interdependent and a member of the group, rather than just an independent being. In collectivist cultures, people feel as if they belong to a larger in-group or collectives which care for them in exchange for loyalty. As a result, collectivist cultures value collaboration, communalism, constructive interdependence, and a conformity to roles and norms. And a collectivist culture is especially likely to emphasize the importance of social harmony, respectfulness, and group needs over individual needs. Okay, yeah, we sort of talked about that, but I just wanted to hone in on those kind of main points. Let's go to the next slide. Grace, can you hear me? Are you able to go to the next slide? Thank you. Sorry. Okay, so we talked about sort of a larger ecological model, talked about this sort of dimension of culture influencing all of us at that level, and perhaps in different ways if we come from a more individualistic culture compared to if we come from a more collectivist culture. And perhaps one of the most important systems that affect us, our lives, and who we are and how we interact with the world is perhaps our family. Family systems theory has been around since about the 70s as well, and the movement towards kind of conceptualizing people in more of their context, in more of a system, as opposed to just an individual, was really a response or perhaps a critique to early psychodynamic theories, since Freud essentially, and others who looked at individuals to determine or to recognize what might be going on for them, what kinds of issues they might have if they're experiencing depression or PTSD type experiences, or anxiety, fear, other things like that, right? That they sort of conceptualized how to think of people as individuals, and that this sort of family systems model came about as a bit of a critique, saying that it's not appropriate to just look at a kid who's experiencing ADHD or something like that, or depression, as sort of in a vacuum, and just like treat the kid, and not also recognize that those behaviors and the things that are happening can only really be understood within the system that it's happening, the interactions and relationships between the child perhaps and the family, and that they needed to incorporate an understanding of family dynamics, family interactions, in order to help get better in some way, be supported in some way, that everyone needed to be involved in that system. So anyway, that again, still family systems theory incorporate, is even now certainly influential for psychologists, children's counselors, for social workers, things like that. But family systems theory, it shifted the focus from even just the parent-child dyad or even just the individual towards an emphasis on the entire family as a social system. As that social system, a family is conceptualized as having its own characteristics, rules, roles, communication patterns, and power structure above and beyond the individual. Additionally, within the social system framework, a family consists of subsystems, including parent-child relationships, the sibling relationship, marital and co-parenting subsystems. Family members are seen as being interdependent, directly and indirectly influencing each other and other subsystems. For example, a child may indirectly influence the husband-wife dyad. Interactions between the family members are also thought to be transactional. It's, they go both ways. The child influences the parents influence the child. That these interactions between parent and child are bidirectional rather than unidirectional. And causality is circular rather than just linear. Additionally, the microsystem of the family is seen as being embedded within larger systems, like we talked about, the ecological model. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Again, just wanted to give you kind of a general understanding of sort of family systems theory. And now let's kind of look at sort of some of the pieces of that family systems theory, which is essentially the structure in family systems. So we talked about subsystems. So it's the relationships between the couple, between the husband and wife, or LGBTQ couple. It's about the parent and child, or parents and children, or parents and child relationships, those subsystems, the sibling relationships, and how those kids get along with each other, and also obviously with certainly strong in collectivist cultures are the roles of grandparents and other extended family members, who play a really important role in the family, and so are thought of as family members and play important roles as influencing what the family does. And again, not just what one individual person as part of the family does, but how the family functions altogether. They, in family systems theory, talk about boundaries. And so they sort of describe three different kinds of boundaries within those subsystems. Are clear boundaries, which are sort of considered, healthy boundaries, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Rigid boundaries, which mean that essentially influence is really just going one way, or so it's not kind of accepting influence in other directions. It's very rigid and it's only this way. It may even seem distant, and so it's not really an engaged boundary. It's like a rigid boundary, like almost feeling like it's cut off. And then there's also a considered a diffuse boundary, which often kind of gets labeled as sort of enmeshment, essentially where there doesn't seem to be clear or good boundaries, and that people tend to sort of be almost like you can't tell one from the other, that they're kind of always doing the exact same thing, where they sort of talk for each other, or that they just, you almost can't separate them apart, these multiple people altogether. Okay. I want us to talk about how this comes up a lot in co-sponsored groups and sponsors working with families. That many of the co-sponsored groups obviously come from a more individualistic culture and perspective. And so where the clients, the refugee clients, may be coming from a more collectivist culture, how we define what's a clear boundary and what perhaps is a diffuse boundary is very much culturally dependent. And so it might seem to someone from an individualist society that a mom and a teen daughter are enmeshed, that there's a really diffuse boundary going on there, that there really is no separate entity. It's just sort of mom and daughter are sort of the same thing. They talk for each other and they're always doing things together, and not one of them can kind of do their own thing. They're always together, what have you. That it might, it might feel like that, that's not good, that's not healthy, perhaps for the mom or for the daughter. But if we look or allow for some more cultural humility, to allow for the context in which that relationship is happening, you might recognize that perhaps, okay, so perhaps let's just take an example of mom and teenage daughter are kind of always together and they can't do things by themselves. And perhaps there's a real frustration about being able to, who's going to take care of one of the other kids when they get home from school, and who else is going to, I don't know, cook dinner, or who's going to go get groceries or something like that. And there might be some significant stress and frustration on both people's part. But the sort of solution that you might think of to be helpful, coming from an individualist perspective, is to say, like, okay, we need to make sure you two have a much better, clearer boundary with each other. And mom really needs to take responsibility for these things, and teenage daughter needs to, be responsible for herself, and that kind of thing. That really will likely not work. It will likely cause some pretty hurt feelings, even if they just kind of agree with you in person, but then in the end they're not going to actually do it. And then then the sponsor just gets frustrated that well, no one's listening to me, and I told them what really should happen, but they're not doing it, and it's not working. Instead of finding ways to accept that this pattern of behavior between mom and adult and teenage daughter is likely going to be very close, because that relationship is extremely important to them, and in that culture, that is part. The emphasis is on family harmony and the importance of those relationships. And so it's not going to be appropriate to just come in and say, okay, now you guys sort of separate and do your own thing. But how can, in their context, try to create some clearer opportunities to work together in a different way, so that the emphasis is still on togetherness and family harmony. And perhaps that's the way to do it, is to say, I notice that everyone's getting really frustrated when this thing happens, and I wonder, for the betterment of family harmony, if one person takes on this thing and the other person sort of takes on this thing, I wonder if everyone all together, the family, will feel better. That is a respectful way of interacting with someone from a more collectivist culture, instead of just imposing what we think of as like what's appropriate, that we think mom should be doing this and the teenage daughter should be doing this, and they really need to have their own way of thinking, and they should have their own opinions. And it might even come across like you're trying to protect the daughter. Perhaps you want her to have more choices. But if you're not respecting the importance of family cohesion and family understanding and family harmony, you might be setting yourself up to be ignored, or to that you're essentially just not being very helpful. These are just some ways in which that this stuff kind of comes into practice while we're doing this work. And so I'm trying to sort of help recognize the kinds of ways of thinking and how to address some potential issues. So we've talked about subsystems, talked about those boundaries, clear, rigid, diffuse. There's also kind of thinking in terms of hierarchy. So that's essentially the amount of power or authority. This comes about a lot of times when it comes to issues of parenting. And so in some cultures, you know, there is an acceptance of sort of a hierarchy, a more steep hierarchy of sorts. Real power, more power at the top, and very less power at the bottom. Sometimes these are a little bit flatter, where there, yes, certainly is some, you know, authority. Parents should have some authority over kids. Perhaps older siblings should have some authority over younger kids. But, you know, to what extent and what feels right. That's just an area in which sometimes this feels very different between sort of American culture and what we tend to experience generally, and what some of our refugee newcomers and their cultural expectations around parents. And this can be in two different extremes, honestly. I've seen this happen. So let's just talk about an example. With some, from a individualistic and a sort of American cultural expectations, is that, like, so for example, I've seen where refugee kids are sort of expected to be able to kind of roam around and learn the boundaries of, you know, what's okay and you know, how not to get hurt and not to get in trouble or whatever. They learn it on their own. They're allowed to they're given the freedom to go and to learn this. And sometimes to American sort of helicopter parents, this feels like, oh no, oh my goodness, you know, what could, you know, the kids could really be in danger. They could, what, they walk out into the street, what, you know, and a car comes, what, you know. So there are some important things, but it's a way of being parents that, you know, has a certain level of authority that perhaps sometimes it feels like the kids have more authority. Sometimes it feels like, wow, that really came down harsh in the end, you know, that the parents really came down harsher than perhaps seemed warranted. So these are just, I just want to talk about that these are sort of different styles of parenting and acceptance, and that this is hard stuff to navigate sometimes. People have really strong feelings about not wanting kids to roam around because they could really get hurt. But oftentimes, you know, other parents are saying, well, but they won't learn, and, you know, this is how they learn. This is how they learn what's appropriate and what's, you know, what is dangerous and what's not. And, you know, they have other siblings that are going to tell them to, and that kind of thing. And I'm not going to prevent them from trying to learn those learn those skills. So anyway, these are difficult questions and difficult issues to address. I just, again, want us to think about them, to perhaps, again, not just, I want us to recognize that kind of stuff and those sort of assumptions about what's appropriate and what's not and how this stuff works are built into our own belief systems. And sometimes they're appropriate. I'm not saying to just throw them out, but be aware of them and then think about, you know, how do I talk about this in a more sensitive way? How do I understand someone else's perspective? And how do I seek help and support from, you know, the agency staff, from other members of the group or what have you, if you're struggling with something like this, instead of just bulldozing right past it and like thinking that you know better than someone else and what they should be doing. Some other things in family structures come about, such as coalitions, like they're essentially alliances between members of the family against others. And sometimes this, you know, there's difficult things that can happen, like a parent and a child can essentially form a coalition or an alliance against another parent. And unfortunately, it's because there's some anger, frustration, some kind of problem in the relationship of the couple. Oops, sorry, yeah. And that the kid sort of gets triangulated into that relationship, and there becomes sort of a coalition instead of sort of an equal pattern of parenting between each parent. Anyway, those are some other possible things that happen in families in these family systems. Let's go to the next. So in reception and placement services, we want to talk about some core services and wraparound services that are related to families. Some of those core services. So these are the contexts in which some of these issues that we're talking about, recognizing our own biases, recognizing these other different patterns of behavior, patterns and interactions from family members, their expectations and what is ideal for them, that these are likely the places in which those things kind of perhaps come to a head, or there are lots of opportunities perhaps to see different family interactions and related to these core services. So some of those include things like public benefits enrollment, if you as a sponsor are helping to do that, school enrollment, employment services enrollment, and completing and filing affidavits of relationship. That last one is, essentially filing affidavits of relationship for other people overseas, family, to essentially, hopefully, be able to come to the United States and be resettled. And also, like I said, those other issues like public benefits enrollment related to the structure of the family, how many people are in the family, who's responsible for these things. Same with like school enrollment, which can relates to who in the family is going to be employed. Again, employment services really relates to perhaps, again, some other issues that can come up related to those, and we'll talk a little bit more about those. Those wraparound services like practicing English conversation, mentorship, providing school tutoring, employment-related activity and support, providing budget and financial management assistance, and public transportation instruction. Let's go to the next one. So I do want to kind of get to this. There you go. Getting into sort of integration and overall family well-being goals. So similar to like self-sufficiency goals and these other integration goals, to think in terms of family well-being goals. Some of these larger goals that sponsors are helping clients work towards are things like that they have employment income and or can access public benefits to sustain the family and pay bills, that they have access to sustainable transportation and can navigate their community, that they have some basic English and or can access interpretation services when needed, that children are enrolled in school and or appropriate daycare or after school programs if needed, and that the family has a primary care physician and healthcare benefits as well in some capacity. And let's go to the next slide. So those issues, those comments, were some common familial issues that come up in resettlement is there are a lot. We've kind of talked about them throughout kind of the theoretical perspectives on family systems and on others. But some particular issues are things like, let's also recognize that the general refugee experience and the high likelihood of trauma related to fleeing their home and possible separation from family or loss of family members. So, obviously there are issues related to the family that you are working with. Perhaps there was a family member who was killed, and are no longer part of that family. Well, how now does that family function now that a significant member of that family is no longer part of that family? And how has that family adjusted to be able to survive and hopefully thrive in a new home and in a new place? There may very well be continued possible separation from family and loved ones. So perhaps that one family member or multiple family members, perhaps they didn't die, but perhaps they were separated, and perhaps half of the family or other family members, other really important members of that family, and again, it can be extended family, are perhaps still overseas in a refugee camp, in a different refugee camp or something like that. And so the continued loss and the continued separation and the continued, hope for reunification. But right now, the family is functioning in a way that, is essentially just dealing with, or just has altered or changed in some way just to survive, and recognize that there is a significant loss in that family and how it normally functions. There certainly can be some power dynamics related to English proficiency. We see this a lot when, kids go to school and they get, daily English practice. And then essentially, there's a normal or natural hierarchy between parents and kids, in lots of ways. But for refugee newcomers, immigrant families, when some kids have some English proficiency, there's definitely a power issue related to that in the family, that they that they have access to more information, and they might get dragged along to more appointments and things like that, and have to function in that sort of way, perhaps sometimes functioning as a translator, in really difficult conversations for their parents, who might not be privy to some of that more sensitive information. So you can imagine how those issues relate. And again, also, perhaps really importantly, the power dynamics related to changes in cultural expectations, especially around gender in family dynamics and in family relationships. So perhaps in the country that they came from and in that culture, there were some pretty strict and gender roles and differences, perhaps for women and their access to things than men, whether it's around money or employment or other things. And now they're in a different situation, and there might be a struggle. There might be different expectations now, and different opportunities towards towards those expectations around perhaps employment, and gendered expectations around family relationships and other responsibilities for kids or things like that. And that you can recognize that those things might be happening while you're doing these core services, while you're doing these wraparound services, while you're interacting with the family, that you can tell that these things are sort of in flux, and that they are, in real time having to adjust and try to integrate into their new life here in the United States. Let's go to the next slide. So that's it. I hope, again, this was a broad perspective. It was some theoretical issues. I tried to make them relevant to some specific core services and specific things. And we tried to talk a little bit about generally some issues related to family dynamics and how they might show up. I wanted this session to really be kind of just a thinker, to think more about some what kinds of things might show up, to be a little bit more aware of it. But really, I hope the takeaway point is to try to recognize what's going on for yourself when you are feeling uncomfortable dealing with or witnessing or being supportive in a situation where these different family dynamics and cultural issues are kind of in play, and that to not just bulldoze right through it and just try to fix everyone else's issues because you think that you know what's best. Is to really just recognize that you might have a certain way of thinking about it because of the cultural expectations that you come from. They might have a different perspective. And so I just want you to be more aware of what that other perspective might be, or what that might feel like, how to try to navigate that, and always to try to look for additional support whenever you need it. To be able to talk about this stuff openly, honestly, and with a bit of humility. So just wanted to thank you for that. We do have a couple of minutes, so this is a Q&A opportunity. If anyone has any, you can submit a question in the questions box. I'll wait just a minute or two, and if not, that's totally okay. I'll conclude here in just a minute. But if anyone does have a question, please feel free to put that in the questions box. And again, if not, that is okay. I will conclude and just say thank you to everyone today for attending today's RWC Lunch and Learn. Grace, if you could go to the next slide. We'd like to hear from you and receive any feedback on today's Lunch and Learn and hear your suggestions for future Lunch and Learn topics. We ask that you take a moment now to complete a survey. You can use your phone or to follow the QR code on the screen, or you can follow the link in the chat. And we look forward to hearing from you regarding that. After today's session, you'll receive a follow-up email with a link to view a recording of today's webinar. Please feel free to share that with others. And on behalf of Refugee Welcome Collective, thank you for joining us and hope you have a great rest of your day.